Donald Trump's behavior is being used to make a serious political claim about his fitness for office, but the clips being circulated do not, by themselves, prove the medical conclusions some of his critics are attaching to them. That distinction matters because elected officials are now invoking the 25th Amendment while the White House presents the very same appearances as evidence of energy, transparency, and presidential accomplishment. So the question is bigger than whether Trump said something strange about a flagpole or a piece of stone. The question is what the public can actually establish from the record. What is interpretation and what evidence would be required before concerns about presidential fitness become something more than partisan arguments? Start with the event that triggered much of this latest reaction. Trump took reporters around the White House grounds and spent considerable time discussing physical changes to the property. He talked about flagpoles. He described one as top of the line. He emphasized that it was tapered rather than straight. And then he made the kind of statement that instantly became a viral clip. I'm very good at flagpoles. That happened. You can criticize it. You can find it funny, bizarre, trivial, or perfectly harmless. What you cannot responsibly do is move directly from that sentence to a medical diagnosis. A president talking at unusual length about a flagpole is evidence that a president talked at unusual length about a flagpole. Anything beyond that requires additional evidence. And this is the first place where the political packaging becomes important. Trump's critics are presenting these moments as part of a pattern. The White House, meanwhile, is packaging them almost in the opposite direction. Its social media operations celebrated Trump walking around the grounds with reporters, promoted the new White House helipad, and portrayed the scene as presidential accessibility. According to the material we have, one White House post described him as a lion among sheep. Another framed reporters following Trump around the property as evidence of extraordinary transparency. Same event, completely different conclusion. So which conclusion does the underlying evidence actually support? The strongest answer right now is more limited than either side may want. The footage supports scrutiny of Trump's public behavior. It does not independently establish cognitive impairment, and the White House's celebratory captions do not establish that concerns about his fitness are baseless either. They are political messaging, not medical evidence. That distinction becomes even more important when you look at another moment from the tour. Trump began talking about stone. He described it as extremely durable and said it had what he called a million-year life. Then he moved into a comparison between natural materials and human life, including the observation that grass has a life and humans have a life. Again, critics immediately treated the language itself as proof that something was wrong. But consider the standard we are being asked to accept. If an awkward sentence, a strange analogy, or an obsession with construction materials is enough to prove incapacity, that standard will not stay confined to Donald Trump. It becomes a standard that can be deployed against any aging president whose public appearances produce enough awkward clips. The legitimate concern is not that Trump used an odd analogy. It is whether these episodes form part of a documented decline that materially interferes with his ability to discharge presidential duties. And the source material does not give us the medical evidence necessary to answer that question definitively. That may be less emotionally satisfying than declaring the case closed. But it is much more important because there is another fact here that is undeniable. This debate has escaped social media and entered formal political conversation. California Governor Gavin Newsom publicly invoked the 25th Amendment in response to another Trump controversy. Former South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford, a Republican, publicly described what he was seeing as frightening and offered his own interpretation of Trump's preoccupation with leaving physical marks around Washington. That changes the story. We are no longer talking only about commentators clipping a president for entertainment. Political figures are openly discussing whether Trump's conduct reflects something serious enough to implicate presidential fitness. And once politicians invoke the 25th Amendment, the evidentiary standard should become higher, not lower. Think about that standard for a moment. If a president you supported were targeted with the 25th Amendment, largely because opponents assembled a collection of strange public remarks, would you consider that enough? Or would you demand medical evidence showing an actual inability to perform the job? That same standard has to survive a change in political identity. Now look at what Sanford actually argued, because his criticism is more specific than simply calling Trump confused. Sanford focused on what he sees as Trump's concern with permanence and legacy. He pointed to projects and naming decisions and argued that Trump appears unusually interested in leaving visible evidence that he was there. The helipad became a perfect symbol for that argument. Trump showed reporters the new installation. He held up an image of it. He praised the people who worked on it. He signed a piece of marble connected to the project. Then, after looking at his signature, he joked about flipping the stone so that the sign side would remain visible. That moment can support a political criticism without supporting a medical diagnosis. A president who devotes significant public attention to marble, signatures, flagpoles, and construction projects while Americans are worried about the cost of living can fairly be questioned about priorities. You do not need to speculate about disease to make that argument. The evidence is sitting right there in the contrast between what the president chose to showcase and the problems citizens expect the government to address. And Sanford made exactly that kind of argument. He contrasted concern about the marble on a helicopter landing area with the economic pressures facing working people. That is a political judgment voters can evaluate. But the source material repeatedly goes further. It describes Trump as physically and cognitively deteriorating. It characterizes particular facial expressions and moments of apparent fatigue as medical evidence. It references critics saying Trump looked as though he was falling asleep while standing during an event. Those observations may justify questions, they do not settle them. A short clip can establish what the camera captured. It cannot tell you the cause. Was the person exhausted, distracted, blinking, experiencing a medical problem? Did the clip omit what happened immediately before or afterward? Without additional evidence, those possibilities remain possibilities, and that is precisely where politically motivated information becomes dangerous. The underlying footage can be authentic while the conclusion attached to it is still stronger than the footage supports. That is the first major finding here. There is real footage, there are real statements, there are real politicians expressing concern, but the medical conclusion being promoted by some critics outruns what these clips alone can prove. And notice what happens if we separate those two things. The legitimate questions do not disappear, they become clearer. Why is the president spending so much public attention on these White House construction projects? Why is the White House turning them into elaborate social media content? Why are concerns about presidential fitness being answered primarily through political imagery rather than through evidence capable of resolving those concerns? And if critics believe the 25th Amendment is warranted, what evidence do they possess beyond the material the public has already seen? Those are answerable questions. Does this clip look weird? Is not an adequate substitute. This is also where credibility becomes part of the story. A politically engaged viewer could watch an authentic clip, hear a confident interpretation attached to it, and understandably assume the interpretation was established too. The mechanism is simple. Genuine evidence is placed beside a conclusion that the evidence does not fully prove. The clip lends its authenticity to the interpretation. And if you repeat that interpretation as fact, the person who packaged it gets the political benefit while you inherit the credibility risk. Don't get played. The evidence discipline for American politics is a ready-to-use system for separating the authentic evidence from the conclusion attached to it. That method works on the next clip, poll, filing, statistic, or political narrative too. The complete digital ebook is only $9 one time. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment. Because the 25th Amendment claim exposes an even more consequential evidence gap. The 25th Amendment is not simply a mechanism by which political opponents declare that a president seems unwell. Section 4 provides a constitutional process dealing with a president who is unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. The crucial word is unable. Political disagreement is not inability. Unusual speech is not automatically inability. Age is not inability. Even a diagnosed medical condition would not necessarily establish inability without evidence that it prevented the president from carrying out the job. That is why casually invoking the amendment creates a problem for Trump's critics. If they want the public to treat this as a constitutional question rather than political rhetoric, then they have to demonstrate the connection between the behavior they are documenting and an actual inability to perform presidential duties. The material supplied here does not establish that connection. It does, however, contain a reference to Congressman Jamie Raskin and the possibility of congressional scrutiny of presidential fitness, including medical information, if such scrutiny actually obtains reliable records, testimony, or medical evidence that could materially change what the public knows. But notice the difference. A medical record is evidence of a different category from a viral video. A physician's documented assessment is different from a commentator's interpretation of somebody's face. Evidence showing that a president could not understand, execute, or discharge a constitutional responsibility would be different from evidence showing that he talked about tapered flagpoles for too long. Those distinctions are not defenses of Trump, they are defenses of the standard. And there is another piece of this story that demonstrates why that standard matters. One critic cited in the material made a joke about Trump's physical capacity in connection with speculation about Natalie Harp. That may work as partisan entertainment. It contributes almost nothing to establishing presidential incapacity. In fact, it risks weakening the serious case. If there is genuine evidence that the president cannot perform his duties, burying it underneath jokes about his body or sex life makes the evidence easier for his defenders to dismiss as another partisan attack. That is not merely a question of tone, it is a question of political effectiveness. Strong evidence does not need weak arguments standing in front of it. So imagine you are a Trump critic who genuinely believes his condition has deteriorated. What should you want? You should want the strongest possible evidence. You should want complete clips rather than selectively framed moments. You should want medical records where lawfully obtainable. You should want contemporaneous accounts from people responsible for presidential operations. You should want specific examples showing an inability to execute official responsibilities. And you should want a clear distinction between something embarrassing, something eccentric, something age-related, and something constitutionally disabling. Anything less gives Trump's defenders an easy answer. This is just another attempt to medicalize political dislike, and that defense deserves to be taken seriously enough to test. The strongest reasonable defense of Trump is straightforward. Presidents talk informally. Trump has always spoken in an unconventional, repetitive, improvisational style. A tour of White House construction naturally produces comments about stone, grass, flagpoles, signatures, and contractors. A person appearing tired for a moment is not evidence of dementia. And political opponents have an obvious incentive to interpret ambiguous behavior in the most damaging possible way. Parts of that defense are persuasive. The clips alone do not establish dementia. The source material does not provide a diagnosis. It does not provide a neurological examination. It does not demonstrate through medical documentation that Trump is unable to perform presidential duties. But the defense does not eliminate every legitimate concern either. Because the public is entitled to evaluate patterns in a president's conduct, age and health matter when the job involves enormous executive authority. Repeated unusual public appearances can reasonably prompt requests for more information. And when the White House responds to those concerns with flattering social media captions, that does not answer the underlying question. So where should the burden fall? If critics demand constitutional action, the burden is on them to establish incapacity with evidence proportionate to that extraordinary demand. If the White House insists that every concern is fabricated or politically motivated, it should recognize that transparent, credible information is more persuasive than branding Trump as a lion among sheep. Both sides can fail the evidence test at the same time. And this is the reflection worth having. If the White House released credible evidence addressing a specific concern, would Trump's critics change their conclusion? And if credible medical evidence showed a serious inability to perform presidential duties, would his supporters change theirs? If the answer is no in either direction, then evidence is no longer determining the conclusion. Political identity is. Now return to the helipad, because something important gets lost when every strange presidential moment is converted into a health diagnosis. There is a substantive political question underneath it. Presidential attention is a resource. When the president spends public appearances emphasizing renovations, construction details, signatures, or monuments, voters are allowed to ask what that reveals about his priorities. Sanford's criticism was essentially that these visible symbols of permanence looked disconnected from the economic concerns occupying ordinary households. That argument stands or falls without diagnosing Trump. The same is true of another subject in the source material, Iran. Trump is quoted announcing an extraordinarily aggressive economic campaign against Iran. He said countries allowing financial institutions, businesses, airports, or government entities to provide certain forms of assistance to Iran would face major economic consequences. He referenced oil smuggling, financial transfers, exchange houses, ship registries, and front companies. That is consequential presidential policy, and it gives us a much better test of fitness than jokes about Stone. What decisions is the administration making? What are the consequences? What evidence supports those decisions? What advice is the president receiving? What legal authorities are being used? What risks are being imposed on Americans and allies? Those questions test governance. The source material attacks Trump's Iran policy and alleges that his approach has been catastrophic. But it does not provide enough independent documentation here to establish all of those broader claims, so we should not pretend it does. What we can establish from the material is that Trump publicly described a sweeping economic strategy toward Iran, while around the same period, critics were circulating clips questioning his physical and cognitive condition. That creates an important distinction. If you believe Trump is medically incapable of governing, prove incapacity. If you believe his Iran policy is dangerous, prove the policy case. Do not substitute one for the other. A terrible policy decision does not prove dementia, and a medical problem, if one exists, would not by itself prove that every policy decision made by that administration is wrong. Separating those claims makes political criticism stronger, not weaker. There is another reason to insist on this discipline. Once the 25th Amendment becomes routine partisan language, future presidents inherit the precedent. Imagine the parties reversed. Imagine a Democratic president in his late 70s or 80s stumbling over a sentence, discussing an obscure renovation, appearing exhausted during an event, and becoming the subject of dozens of hostile clips. Now imagine Republican governors demanding the 25th Amendment based largely on those appearances. Would Democrats accept that evidentiary standard? They should not. Neither should Republicans when the target is Trump. The constitutional standard cannot depend on whose name appears on the ballot. But that does not mean voters must ignore what they can see. Public behavior is evidence. It simply has limits. A pattern can justify investigation before it justifies a conclusion. That is the line the current political debate keeps crossing. Critics see behavior they consider alarming and jump from observation to diagnosis. Supporters see politically motivated criticism and jump from bias to dismissal. Neither move resolves the factual question. The correct next step is evidence capable of distinguishing among the plausible explanations. And this is where the question of transparency becomes more serious than the White House's social media joke about reporters chasing Trump around the grounds. Transparency is not merely physical access to a president. A reporter being allowed to watch Trump discuss marble does not answer questions about presidential health. If legitimate concerns exist, meaningful transparency means information relevant to those concerns. At the same time, privacy and medical confidentiality do not disappear simply because somebody becomes president. There are real boundaries here. The public interest in presidential capacity must be weighed against the danger of turning every private medical detail into political ammunition. So the standard cannot be release everything because opponents are suspicious. It has to be targeted. What information is necessary to establish that the president can discharge the powers and duties of the office? What assessments have been performed? What conclusions were reached? And are public representations about presidential health consistent with the underlying evidence? Those questions would move this story forward. Another compilation of awkward clips probably will not. And there is one more uncomfortable fact for Trump's critics. The more exaggerated the rhetoric becomes, the easier it is for the White House to avoid the strongest questions. If every eccentric statement becomes proof of severe cognitive impairment, then defenders only need to disprove the exaggeration. They never have to address the narrower and potentially more credible concerns about age, stamina, transparency, decision-making, or whether additional medical disclosure is warranted. Overstatement becomes an escape hatch. The opposite is true for Trump's supporters. If every concern is dismissed as partisan hatred, they create their own credibility problem. Presidents are not entitled to a presumption of perfect health because their supporters distrust the people asking questions. If new evidence emerges, it has to be evaluated on its merits. That is what evidence discipline looks like when it becomes politically uncomfortable. You do not lower the standard for the politician you hate. You do not raise it beyond reach for the politician you love. And you do not confuse an unanswered question with a proven accusation. So what does this record actually establish? Trump publicly spent considerable time discussing White House property projects, including flagpoles, stone, the helipad, and his signature on material associated with that project. Critics have characterized some of those appearances as evidence of cognitive or physical deterioration. Political figures, including Newsom, have invoked the 25th Amendment, while former Republican Governor Mark Sanford has publicly described Trump's apparent preoccupation with legacy and permanence as frightening. Those are real parts of the political record presented here. What remains unestablished is the most serious claim. The material does not medically establish dementia. It does not demonstrate through clinical evidence that Trump is incapable of discharging presidential duties. It does not allow us to determine the cause of moments in which critics say he appeared tired or unusual, and it does not transform political commentary into medical diagnosis merely because the underlying footage is authentic. But that does not make the entire controversy meaningless. It means the investigation has reached the point where better evidence is required. If members of Congress pursue presidential medical information through lawful oversight, that evidence could sharpen the picture. If credible professionals provide documented assessments relevant to presidential capacity, those assessments would deserve serious attention. If evidence emerges connecting health problems to failures in carrying out presidential responsibilities, the constitutional argument changes dramatically. Until then, the 25th Amendment should not become a substitute for proving the case, and there is a broader political lesson here that reaches far beyond Trump. We are living in an environment where authentic material and unsupported certainty travel together. A real video appears, somebody supplies the interpretation. A partisan account clips the most emotionally powerful seconds. Another account repeats the conclusion. Within hours, millions of people are no longer arguing about what the footage shows. They are arguing about a medical or political conclusion that may never have been established in the first place. That mechanism works in every direction. It can be used against Trump. It can be used by Trump. It can be used against Democrats, Republicans, judges, prosecutors, journalists, activists, or anyone else whose image can be reduced to 30 seconds of content. The defense is not political neutrality. The defense is demanding that your own side prove what it says, because strong political convictions deserve evidence strong enough to survive contact with the opposition. Trump's behavior in these appearances can legitimately be scrutinized. His administration's priorities can legitimately be criticized. His decisions on Iran can legitimately be investigated. Questions about presidential health can legitimately be asked, and politicians demanding constitutional action can legitimately be required to meet an extraordinary evidentiary burden. All of those statements can be true at once. The central contradiction we started with, therefore, has a fairly clear answer. The White House cannot prove presidential fitness by posting heroic captions beneath videos of Trump walking around the grounds. Critics cannot prove presidential incapacity simply by assembling clips that look strange. The public deserves something better than competing edits and competing adjectives. It deserves evidence proportional to the claim. If that evidence eventually demonstrates incapacity, political loyalty should not shield a president from the constitutional consequences. If it does not, opponents should not use constitutional language merely because it is rhetorically devastating. That standard protects more than Donald Trump. It protects the credibility of any future attempt to invoke an extraordinary constitutional remedy when a president genuinely cannot perform the job. And it protects voters from being forced into a false choice between believing White House propaganda and believing partisan speculation. The next political clip, poll, filing, accusation, or official explanation will arrive soon, and it will probably ask for your certainty before giving you the full evidence. Without a method, somebody else chooses the frame and you carry the credibility risk. Don't Get Played gives you a complete practical method for testing clips, polls, filings, statistics, official statements, and synthetic media before you repeat the conclusion. The digital ebook costs only $9 as a one-time payment. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment. Political reaction is easy. A defensible conclusion has to survive the evidence.